Hi, class. I hope you all are having a good day today. I am here with you to talk about the writer Alice Walker and her 1973 short story, Everyday Use. Okay. I chose this story for a couple of reasons. Number one, I'm a big fan of Alice Walker and I love this story. Also, I feel like the conflict that this story presents is a little bit more subtle and maybe also something that is easier for us to relate to because we see the conflict has to do with two sisters and their different view of culture and heritage. Okay, so on the one hand, we have the older sister Dee, who has left home, right? She's got an education, she's involved herself in the civil rights movement, and she understands her culture now in an intellectual way. Okay, so she's been educated by books to understand the cultural significance of her Black heritage, and she wants to preserve it. She wants to frame it. She wants to display it, right? To show her connection to her culture. So it is, I think, kind of performative, right? The quilt and the churn top that she wants to take, right? She views them as aesthetic objects, as artifacts to be preserved, okay, and displayed. In contrast, we see the younger sister, Maggie, right, who is not educated, has not left her home, and instead, right, she views her culture more as a way of life, right, a way for her to remain connected to her family and also to preserve family memories. So the quilt and the churn top, right, she views these things as objects that are there to nourish and to provide warmth, right? And also, right, like I said, to connect her with her family members. Okay, so the story, right, and this creating this contrast begs the question, right, of these two sisters, who is actually more in touch with their culture and their history and also their family, right? And then I also poses the question, right, of these two sisters, who would you give the quilts to? Okay, now we see, we kind of get an idea of how, where Alice Walker stands on this because we see the mother's action at the end of the story. Okay, I also want to say a little bit about the context, the cultural context, right? Because I feel like that's important. So we saw, right, that Alice Walker's character, Dee, right, she has participated and is still participating in the civil rights movement. So we should probably say a little bit about that, right? So Black nationalism, for example, right, during the 1960s and 1970s was when a lot of African American people wanted to connect their culture all the way back to Africa. Okay, so they were trying to trace the history of Black culture to Africa, right? And, why were they trying to do that, right? To really just demonstrate that they had a very important culture, right? And this was around the time when a lot of Black Americans started to refer to themselves as African Americans, right? To demonstrate this shift in their understanding of their history and their heritage. Okay, so Alice Walker is showing us how this new consciousness might affect a family, right? The members within a family. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now so I can say a little bit about the writer, Alice Walker. Okay, move me out of the way. Okay, great. So here we go. Here is Alice Walker. So you can see she was born in 1944. She's still alive. She's currently in her 80s. So she's a novelist, a poet, a short story writer, and also significant, right? She was the first African-American woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And that was in 1982 after the publication of her novel, The Color Purple. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about her childhood briefly, right? But this is important because this will actually give us some insight into understanding the character Maggie. Okay, so in her book, of essays called In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. She writes an essay, and it's one of my favorite autobiographical essays. I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's called Beauty When the Other Dancer is the Self. Okay, so in this essay, she writes about a very traumatic experience that she endured when she was 8 years old. Okay, so I should have said first, right, that she was born in Georgia, rural Georgia, and she was the youngest in a family of 8. Okay, so when she was 8, one day she was outside her house, right in her yard, playing cowboys and Indians with her brothers. Okay, now her brothers had BB guns, right? She did not. And if you know what a BB gun is, it's a gun, right? But it doesn't shoot bullets. It shoots BBs. And BBs are these like small, I believe they're made out of stainless steel, like pellets. Okay. So anyway, so her brothers were shooting these BB guns, and unfortunately, Alice Walker was hit in the eye. Okay, so immediately, right, she felt terrible pain. She didn't really know what had happened. She describes in this essay, right, sort of like laying down and like looking up and seeing a tree, and that was the very last thing that she ever saw out of that eye. Okay, so because ultimately she became blind in that eye. Okay, so her brothers were, oh my God, please don't tell mom and dad, say it was an accident. And so she did, right? Initially said it was an accident. Then, of course, they found out what had actually happened. And she did not get any medical attention for over 24 hours, right? Her parents were very poor. They did not have a car, right? Her father and her stood on the side of the road trying to, flag down cars to stop. Nobody would stop, right, to drive her to the hospital. So it wasn't until the very next day that she got medical attention. And she describes in the essay the experience of hearing the medical doctor explain to her parents that, she was going to be blind in that eye, and that eyes are sympathetic, and that if she became blind in one eye, it was very likely that she would become blind in the other eye as well. And she describes how that experience she felt, right, ultimately resulted in her becoming a writer, because she was very concerned about losing her vision, and she tried to write everything down so that she wouldn't forget, right, what she saw. And she also writes about how this experience affected her emotions, her perception of herself, right? Prior to this horrible accident, she felt like she was beautiful. She was very confident. She was very sassy, right? Very outgoing. But after the accident, she became extremely self-conscious. She felt ugly because the eye that was blind, it kind of turned in a little bit. There was a lot of scar tissue. And she said that she just could not even raise her head to make eye contact with anyone after that accident, right? She was very self-conscious and insecure and withdrawn and shy. Okay. Now I'm bringing this up because, after you've read the story, you probably notice, wow, that actually does remind us of the character Maggie, right? Because we learn that Maggie has been badly scarred by a fire, right? This fire that burned her house down when she was a child. That after that fire, right, she became very shy and withdrawn. Okay. All right, so a little bit more about Alice Walker. So ultimately, right, one of her brothers actually raised money when for her to have a surgery to have some of the scar tissue removed from her eye, and that was when she was 14. Okay, so then she started to feel a little bit more confident, right? She still had some scar tissue though, so she was still, very aware of that. Let me move forward here a little bit with my pictures. So she went to Sarah Lawrence College in New York, right, on a scholarship. And while she was living in New York, she participated in the civil rights demonstrations and movement. She also met a man named Mel Leventhal, and you can see his pictures here. He, as you can see, is white, right? He is Jewish, and he was a civil rights attorney. Okay, so in 1967, they got married. And this was in Jackson, Mississippi when they got married. And they were the very first married interracial couple in the city. Okay, and so they did receive a lot of threats. They felt a lot of prejudice. They also, as you can see, have a baby, a daughter. And then these are just some pictures of Alice Walker when she was young. These are some of her more famous works of literature. So you can see, maybe you recognize the names of some of these books. I think that The Color Purple, right, her novel from 1982 is very well known. You know, it was also made into a movie, actually, produced by Quincy Jones, right, directed by Steven Spielberg, right? Such a good movie. I just actually rewatched it because I'm very excited to see the new version, right? And there's also a musical version. So it's such a good book. Rereading it, I really came to love it even more. And then the collection of essays that I, again, recommend so highly, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. And then also The Temple of My Familiar. And then these are some more recent pictures of her, right? How cool. She was on the cover of Ms. Magazine with Gloria Steinem, how cool is that? Ah. Oh, and then I thought this was such a great quote. So Alice Walker said, "The most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any." How thought-provoking, right? And I also feel like that quote reminds me of Maggie, right, from the story, because I kind of see that Maggie, in a sense, does that. Right? She's so anxious, like she's so willing to just give up the quilts to her sister. Okay, let me stop sharing my screen now so I can say a little bit more about the story. Okay, so the story, right, as you're reading it, again, thinking about the way these two sisters view culture and heritage, I really feel like it's very important for us to also think about the point of view. So we're going back to the first person with this story, right? So we have a first person narrator, and who is that? The mother, right? Mama. Okay, so everything that we know about the sisters, about the situation, comes from the mother. Okay, so we have to think about her prejudices, her biases. Okay, now she's a mother. So, these two daughters, we're thinking that she loves both of her children equally. Okay. And so that, she's in a very difficult position because she has to choose which one of her daughters is going to get the quilts. Okay. So that's kind of a tough position to be in. Okay. Now, ultimately, and I'm spoiling the plot. So if you haven't finished reading the story, please stop this video, go back and finish reading, right? But we see her choice is Maggie. Okay, so she decides to give the quilts to Maggie, which I feel like gives us some insight, right, into Alice Walker's own belief, right, which seems to be that one's culture, one's heritage is something that we should live, right, that we should immerse ourselves in, right? It's not just something that we're going to preserve and frame and hang on the wall, okay, to show, right, other people, right? She wants us to live the culture. Okay, so that's important, right? Because we can only imagine if this story, say, was told in the first person point of view from the perspective of Dee, right? We would probably have a very different opinion about the mother and about Maggie. Okay, same thing if the story was told from the perspective of Maggie, right? We would have a very different view of the mother and especially of the sister, right? Okay, so that's important, right? First person point of view, right? We get the mother's insights. And then also, right, the setting, right? As I mentioned, this is published in 1973, but it seems as though Alice Walker is kind of going back a little bit, right? Writing about the 1960s because of this mention of Dee, right? Participating in the movement, which is what she refers to it as. Okay, so we see this contrast between these two sisters, Maggie and Dee, And wow, right? I can't really think of two sisters that are more different than Maggie and Dee, right? We see that Maggie is very withdrawn, very shy, right? She's described as being, this is a quote, not bright, right? She's also described as resembling a quote, lame animal. And I think that those descriptions, in my opinion, not really that positive, right? The way she walks with her head always down, right? She can't articulate her own opinions about things. But yet she's very likable in the story, right? Because we see how connected she is to the family members, right? That she actually took the time to learn how to quilt, right? She learned that from her aunt, right? That she, right, it's very important to her to like maintain these cultural traditions. Now, in contrast, we see the character Dee, right, who is very, outgoing, very strong woman, very intelligent woman, right? She left home to get an education and she became politically active, right? And I feel like these are all things that we would admire in somebody. But yet, the story paints her, I believe, in a very unflattering light, right? She's very greedy. She seems to be very manipulative, right? And also not really that connected to her family, right? She's left, home to go away to school. And the mother insinuates that, she doesn't even write any letters home, right? This is her first visit in many, many, many years. So, not really connected to her family in the same way that Maggie is. And then of course, like right when she comes home, right? And this is a question on the quiz, right? First thing she does before she even like goes over to her mom to give her a hug, to give her a kiss. She hasn't seen her mom or her sister in years. What's the first thing she does? Right. And I feel like this is very telling. She whips out her camera and she's like taking pictures of the house, her mother, right? Even like, can I get a cow in the background, right? We kind of get the sense, why is she taking these pictures? Because she wants to be able to take them back home to the city with her, to college with her, to show people, look, these are my roots, right? Look at how authentic I am, right? Coming from this humble upbringing, this very rural setting, to show something, and this is something we can all, maybe to an extent relate to, right? How many of us are guilty of this? When you're at a restaurant, you order your food, the meal comes before you can even like take a bite. Got to get iPhone out to get that picture so that you can, post a picture of your food, or whatever it is on Instagram or Facebook or, whatever, right? So, so I'm not judging. I'm just saying it's very interesting that that's what Dee's response is, right? She doesn't enjoy the moment for what it is. Instead, she's very anxious to take the picture so that she has evidence, right, to prove, something about herself, to show others something about herself. At least that's how I read it. And then I feel like the moment when she's really extremely unlikable, and let me go ahead and share my screen so I could pull the text up. And now I unfortunately used up all my clicks on the Harper's, right, where I found this story for free, right? So I have to actually just kind of like stay in the box here because I can't click on the link. But this is, I think, the climax of the story, the moment when Dee is like going through the old, hope chest, looking, and she sees the quilts and she immediately wants them. Interestingly, the mother says, I wanted to give these to you when you first went away to college, but then you didn't want them. Then you viewed them as being old fashioned, right? A symbol maybe of her poverty, in the sense that they couldn't afford to buy quilts, right? These were like homemade quilts made from pieces of material that came from old clothing. Again, a symbol of their poverty. And that then Dee did not want those quilts. No, right? It's only now that she's become educated and she understands the cultural significance of these quilts that now she appreciates them, right? Now she wants them. And the way she responds, right, when the mother says, well, actually, I've already promised these quilts to Maggie, for when she gets married. And how does Dee respond? Maggie can't appreciate these quilts. She'd probably be backward enough to put them to everyday use. Okay, now, oh my gosh, right? I mean, that's pretty judgmental, because we disagree. Maggie does appreciate the quilts. And then implying that Maggie is backward, enough to actually use the quilt, heaven forbid, right? She used it for what it's intended for, right? From Dee's perspective, that would be a tragedy. What a waste, right? Because these quilts, as she goes on to explain, are priceless. Okay, which is true, right? So again, I feel like this dilemma that Alice Walker is presenting is so interesting because part of me agrees with Dee here. Yeah, right? If you use the quilts, they probably are going to wear out and they're not going to be around any longer, right? By preserving them, we'll have them for a long time. More people can appreciate them. Okay, so again, I feel like the way Alice Walker portrays Dee in such an unlikable way, kind of gives us some insight as to where she stands on this argument. Right. And then, of course, she explains to the mother, what would I do with the quilts? I would hang them. Right? So again, display them. And then, of course, we see that Maggie, oh, she can have them, Mama. I can remember Grandma Dee without the quilts. Okay, so again, like her intention is to use these cultural artifacts as a way to remember her family members. Okay, so let me stop sharing now. What else is really important in this story? Certainly symbolism. Okay, obviously the quilts are a very important symbol, right? And the different ways that these family members view the quilts. Also very symbolic, and we haven't mentioned yet, are the names. Okay, so Dee, I keep referring to her as Dee, right? But as we know, she doesn't refer to herself as Dee anymore, right? Because she explains to her mother that she's changed her name, right? Now her name is Wanjero. And why did she change her name? Well, she tells her mother that she couldn't stand any longer to be named after the people who oppress her. Okay, now what is she referring to, right? She's referring to during slavery, right? When slaves were kidnapped, right? Removed from Africa and brought against their will here to the US, they were renamed. Okay, so that's what she's referring to. So she has taken a name, Wanjero, right? That is an African name. Okay. Now, what's interesting is the mother says, well, actually, you were named after your Aunt Dicey, your Aunt Dee. So this name, right, can also be traced back to her family, right? Traced back through the generations of her family. Okay, whereas Wanjero cannot, right? That can be traced back to Africa. So again, a very important symbol. And then I think that it's also important for us to say something about the way the story ends. Okay, so as I've already said, right, the mother gives the quilts to Maggie. Right? She takes them out of Dee's hands, hands them over to Maggie, right, which shows us her choice, right, her belief, right, that these quilts should be used. And how does the story end, right? Well, we see Wanjero, Dee, leaving in a huff. She's mad. And her parting words, you don't understand your heritage, right? You ought to try to make something of yourself. It's really a new day for us. But from the way you and Mama still live, you'd never know it. Okay, so she has to get one more, very judgmental statement in, right? It's almost implied this is the last time she's going to see them, right? The way she just leaves like that. But I feel like also very important is how we see her sister Maggie respond. Okay, so it's like Maggie gets her way, kind of seems like for the first time. And, I feel like it's very subtle, but we can, I think, view Maggie as a dynamic character, right? Because at the very end of the story, we see for the very first time that she is smiling, right? And it says that she's, quote, not scared. So, why is she smiling? Well, because she has got something that she wanted, these quilts, right? She saw that the mother chose her, right? Endorsed her position. Okay, so I feel like that little change, that smile suggests that maybe there will be a change in her, right? That she is, like I said, a dynamic character. I also, can't help but think about something that happened in 2022 as I'm reading the story. So maybe you remember in 2022, there was this big controversy when Kim Kardashian wore Marilyn Monroe's very famous dress that had been in a museum, right? It was in a museum. And this was the dress that Marilyn Monroe wore when she sang Happy Birthday to the president, right? JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, right? It was his birthday. And she, saying Happy Birthday, Mr. President. And she was wearing this very like form-fitting, like sequined dress. Okay. And that dress had been in a museum for many years. Well, Kim Kardashian, I'm not exactly sure how, right? But she was able to get that dress to wear, right, for one night to this Met Gala, right? The Metropolitan Museum of Art, the gala. She wore the dress. And it was like a lot of controversy. A lot of people were like, yes, finally, this dress, it should be worn, right? It should be seen and appreciated. Some beautiful woman wearing it again, right? And then the other side of the controversy were people who said, oh my God, she should not be wearing this dress. It should be behind a glass wall in a museum so that everybody can enjoy it. It can be preserved. I just found myself thinking about that as I was reflecting on the story, right? And what is the best way for us to treat cultural artifacts, right? Should they be used, worn, or should they be displayed? Okay, so this is something I was thinking about. And again, I can't wait to read your thoughts on the discussion board, right? And who you would give the quilts to, right? If you had that choice. All right, well, I'm going to end this video now. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.